Hello and welcome to Strat News Global. I'm Parul Chandra and with me today is Tenzin Dawa. Tenzin is a researcher with the Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy, which is based in Dharamsala in the state of Himachal Pradesh. Tenzin has been looking at the human rights violations in Tibet during her research with the center, and she's here to talk about it with us on Strat News Global. Welcome to Strat News Global, Tenzin.
Thank you, Parul, for having me on your show.
Let me begin by asking you first, can you give us a brief overview of human rights violations by the Chinese authorities in Tibet?
Right. Ever since the invasion of Tibet by the Chinese government in 1959, the Chinese government have been actively implementing numerous assimilationist and repressive policies in Tibet. And under these, policies, Tibetans are specifically targeted for their very identity and culture. And thereby, it makes very difficult for the Tibetans inside Tibet to live a life of dignity. And over the past, more than 6 decades, under the oppression of the Chinese government, there is persistent political repression, uh, marginalization of economic, cultural assimilation, environmental destruction, and social discriminations in Tibet.
Now, you spoke about the culture and identity of Tibetans, which is under attack or which is being persecuted by the Chinese in the Tibet autonomous region. How are they going about repressing Tibetans in this area?
You know, for many years, the Chinese government has been, implementing these various aggressive policies of, for example, I give an example of the bilingual education policy in Tibet. So under this policy, what the Chinese government is basically doing is to aggressively promote Mandarin language as the main medium of instruction in Tibetan schools, and in that marginalizes the Tibetan language at the same time. So in 2019 alone, we saw that Chinese government has issued local directives in many rural townships in the Tibet Autonomous Region, asking them to switch to using Mandarin as the main medium of instructions. Now, this is we see this as a systematic approach from the side of the Chinese government to forcibly estrange Tibetan children and Tibetans in future to forcibly estrange them from the very survival of Tibetan culture and language in the many years to come. So, and also at the same time, nowadays we're seeing this trend of this Chinese government, issuing a lot of local directives that involves directing Tibetan parents of children to, hold them responsible for responsible for sending them to attend religious festivals during the children's school holidays, so as to separate them from their Tibetan very identity and culture, which is deeply also enrooted in the Tibetan religion. So seeing the systematic approaches by the Chinese government in many Tibetan areas.
You mentioned how they're trying to put curbs on the observance of, say, Tibetan festivals, religious festivals. Now, there are also reports of how the Chinese are trying to curtail the Tibetan religion and in the region. And in fact, there are reports of the Sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism. Now, how are they going about this? Can you shed some light on this?
Sure. So the Sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism was, this plan was formally approved at the 19th Standing Committee meeting of the Buddhist Association of China in July last year in Beijing. So under this plan, it requires all Tibetan Buddhist practitioners to prioritize the promotion and implementation of party policies on religion in order to, make religions Chinese. And so the Sinicization of this Tibetan Buddhism is basically an effort from the side of the Chinese government to shape Tibetan Buddhism to party's dictates. So whatever the government says, Tibetan Buddhists, have to obey to that. And this Sinicization of this Buddhism includes stricter control over monastic recruitment and setting up patriotic education classes in Buddhist colleges and other institutions. And also, this Sinicization not only targets the trappings of religious practice, but it is also an intrusion into people's inner lives by a repressive government. So uh, so at the same time, these at the same time, under this campaign, they're sending a lot of Tibetan Buddhist practitioners into political indoctrination campaigns, and these campaigns have intensified, especially under Xi Jinping, President Xi Jinping. These campaigns are, religiously blasphemous in nature and inherently coercive, where monks and nuns are punished for exercising their beliefs and for following their conscience, basically. And they have left no option but to denounce their spiritual leader, including the Dalai Lama and other revered Tibetan Buddhist lamas. So monks and nuns and many Tibetans during these indoctrination campaigns have to, denounce their religious leaders, and they are made to sing, patriotic songs, which basically states love the motherland and the party states and things like that. So these indoctrination campaigns are, are carried out and conducted on a, very mass scale in every village in Tibet.
If I may ask a follow-up question to this, these are indoctrination campaigns, you said, right? Now, are these on the lines of, say, the re-education camps or the vocational training centers that the Chinese have in the Xinjiang province? And because they seem to be very coercive in nature, you can ask, say, the Tibetan monks and nuns to repeat the Communist Party slogans, etc. But what after that? I mean, do they really adhere to this kind of brainwashing by the Chinese?
Well, not really. They are, basically imposed and coerced to send to be into these indoctrination campaigns. But if you really look into the people of ethnic minorities, specifically the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, you see that it's impossible to, quite impossible to change their beliefs. And especially if you look into this ethnic unity law that was passed this year in May this year, it's quite evident that Chinese government has, over the last more than 6 decades, their occupation during the occupation of Tibet, they've quite failed to, win the hearts and minds of the Tibetan people, and hence, they're having to implement these regulations so as to, really impose these sort of regulations on the Tibetans and other ethnic minorities. So I don't think they are really able to really win the hearts and minds of Tibetans, but the Chinese government are, trying their best for many years to sort of coerce them into denouncing their religious and cultural beliefs.
Now, can you share with us some thoughts on what are they doing to the monasteries in Tibet?
So basically, in the last many years, we're seeing a complete desecration of Tibetan monasteries in Tibet. Specifically if you look in the year 2016, the Chinese government started demolishing one of the largest Buddhist institutes in Tibet, which is the Larungar, where many Tibetan Buddhist practitioners and Buddhist practitioners across the world come there to practice religion and study Buddhism there. So in 2016, we see this whole demolition of all these monasteries and monastic institutions at the institute, and the Chinese government, they claim that they are trying to better manage this institution, but at the same time, what they're doing is they're destroying the very root of the Tibetan Buddhism center there, and thereby sending all these monks and nuns who are studying there to political indoctrination campaigns again, to denounce their beliefs, political beliefs, and religious beliefs, and all of that in this campaign. So.
You mentioned this ethnic unity law that the Chinese have brought in this year, and they started implementing it from May 1st this year, in fact. What are they trying to do with this law? I've also read reports that they are also encouraging Tibetans to marry the Han Chinese. Are these such reports correct?
Well, this is not explicitly said in the law, but that's one of
Mm-hmm.
the intentions, So basically, and this is a really concerning issue for us because this regulation gives the Chinese authority the complete, Chinese government the complete authority to enforce a Chinese-centric way of life for Tibetans. And this will, further exacerbate the already discriminatory treatment of Tibetans inside Tibet. Because, under this regulation, it requires equal participation of all non-Tibetan ethnic groups at all levels, including at government levels, at school levels, at private companies, or even at religious centers. So and many and under this regulation, many, as you said, Han Chinese are being migrated into Tibet,
Yes.
and this will, further desolate the already grim state of local culture there. So,
Yes.
and if you really look at it, it's strange because you can't really force someone to adopt a culture. I mean, it's a way of life, right? So, and
Yes.
Tibetans must be able to practice their own culture and identity on their own. So, yeah.
Do you have any estimate of the migration that is going on by the Han Chinese into TAR? I know it's very difficult to get any kind of information from Tibet, but do you have any kind of estimates, any numbers on these migrations?
Well, we don't really have statistics because, and
Yes.
first of all, getting information nowadays is very difficult and very challenging
Mm-hmm.
as researchers, specifically with all these bans on communication apps like WeChat and all. So it's very difficult for us to ascertain these reliable information and numbers from Tibet. And also at the same time, government statistics are nothing at all, not at all, reliable. So we don't really refer to the statistics.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me take you on to another topic, and which is about arbitrary arrests and detentions of Tibetans, Tibetan activists, again, Tibetan monks and nuns. And when I heard you speak recently, you also mentioned the fact that uh, these the people who are detained really have no access to any kind of legal help, and even if they do, the Chinese lawyers who take the risk of defending them, in turn face uh, they in turn are targeted by the Chinese authorities. So can you share your thoughts on this with us?
Sure. So, Tibetans inside Tibet are routinely persecuted to, lengthy prison terms or for simply keeping contacts with outsiders. It could be
Mm-hmm.
us, Tibetan living outside in exile, right? And also sharing information on Tibet to outsiders. So they are persecuted and convicted on very vague and overbroad charges of inciting separatism or leaking state secrets or endangering state stability. So all of these very broad charges,
Mm-hmm.
Chinese government have no clear definition of what really constitutes as something as illegal or something as separatist. So, under these charges, once the Tibetans are arrested, they are subjected to very long periods of detention, of incommunicado detention, for instance, because 75% of Tibetan detainees inside Tibet are their family members are not informed of their whereabouts, and their incommunicado detention gets expanded broadly because there is a complete lack of institutional oversight in China. And as you said, as you mentioned before, it's very difficult to ensure a fair trial in China, for instance, because
Mm-hmm.
China doesn't have an independent judiciary. The trials are just a formality, and all the verdicts have already been decided. And Tibetan detainees, they do not get a right to hire legal defense of their choice. And even if
Mm-hmm.
they manage to find one, the lawyers themselves are subjected to harassment, intimidations, and threats, and even revocation of their lawyer's license. And we've done interviews with several Chinese lawyers who have an experience of defending Tibetan cases, and they shared with us the kind of challenges they face, when dealing with Tibetan political detainees. They say that dealing with the case of Tibetan political prisoners are usually looked at as a very sensitive uh, and are often politicized. So
Mm-hmm.
difficult to ensure a fair trial for Tibetan detainees in the Chinese judiciary.
Tenzin, one question again pertaining to the intense surveillance that Tibetans are put under in Tibet, and this is about the grid system that the Chinese have enforced. What exactly is it?
So, the Chinese authorities are using very targeted surveillance tactics to violate the rights of freedom of expression and privacy of ordinary Tibetans, or even journalists, or bloggers inside Tibet, or even human rights defenders in Tibet. So there is a widespread use of surveillance tactics aimed at crushing down on any forms of dissent and silencing human rights informants in Tibet, both online and offline. So offline, like you mentioned, we have the systematic surveillance system campaigns like the grid management systems and the village-based cadre systems. So under these systems, what the Chinese government is basically doing is they're dividing Tibetan towns into grids, and they've stationed police checkpoints on all these neighborhoods, and the Chinese government have stationed at the same time they have stationed thousands of cadre members in these Tibetan areas to act as informants, to monitor Tibetan life, and thereby, it leaves very difficult for Tibetans to freely express in such environment. And at the same time, we have heard from many Tibetans inside Tibet that they're now losing trust upon each other, even in their neighborhoods, and therefore they're having to self-censor themselves. So because if they speak something today, tomorrow, someone might inform the government authorities, and then they get persecuted for just expressing that. So under all these systems, Tibetans are living in a very precarious situation inside Tibet.
Now, you have said that the international community should hold China to account on these laws and ensure that it adheres to it. But how can the international community do this?
As you mentioned, China is a state party to numerous international human rights treaties and covenants.
Yes.
And they cannot just do whatever they wish on based on whatever and however they wish. So, for instance, China has signed and ratified 6 core international human rights treaties, including the Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Violence. We have the Convention Against Torture, Convention against the Child, and Enforced Disappearance. So all these major conventions they have signed and ratified, and now, since they are a party to these conventions, they have a legal obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill these provisions under these treaties in good faith. So therefore, states as a member of the international community, can look into international mechanisms that oversee the functioning of these conventions, including the committees of Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, or Committee on CEDAW, or Committee on on CATS. So all these committees, the states can look into it and make formal complaints of the Chinese disobedience of these conventions, right? So at the same time, states can also adopt consequential rights-related sanctions, like the U.S. Global Magnitsky style sanctions, which are specifically designed to impose consequences for rights violations, including visa bans and freeze of assets for perpetrators of human rights violations. So states can adopt similar sanctions like this in their legislation. And at the same time, states can also cumulatively exert pressure on China to allow, independent fact-finding missions by Tibet, because for many decades, China has not allowed individual experts of civil and political rights to visit Tibet and report information on the ground. Over the past years, Chinese government have allowed economic experts, but not civil and political experts. So states can, cumulatively exert pressure on China to allow these experts to see the real situation there. So as to debunk all these propaganda and government narratives as they always came to, that Tibetans are living a happy life, there is economic development in place. So whether it's really there or not, I think it's incumbent upon all the states to pressure China. And lastly, states states can also ensure that that the or sort of the operations, economic operations, are not in complicit with the human rights violations that the Chinese government is carrying out in Tibet and other ethnic minority areas. So all of these measures, states as a member of international community can take and, pressure China.
You mentioned the international treaties and obligations. Uh, at the same time, you have the UN Human Rights Council, which takes note of human rights violations by various states, countries. Do you feel that the UNHRC has let the Tibetan people down?
Um, over the last many years, there are various mechanisms under Human Rights Council that sort of brings forward specific cases of human rights violations, such as the independent experts and the special rapporteurs and the working groups that work under this Human Rights Council, right? So, as Tibetan human rights defendant, we regularly submit cases of Tibetan political prisoners, deteriorating situation of human rights inside Tibet. They are, they're actually trying their best to exert pressure and communicate with China on these human rights violations. But we see that, the Chinese government, since it enjoys a, really large economic clout in the UN itself,
Yes.
they are sort of trying to silence all of these voices in the UN itself. So there's these challenges there, but we see that the individual experts and the independent experts, they're trying their best to, communicate with the Chinese government.
On that note, Tenzin, thank you so much for sharing your views on human rights violations in Tibet. It was a pleasure having you.